One Last Step. Tara Mills Mystery, Book 1, Chapter 16. Tara and Warren pulled onto the side street and were immediately met with a swarm of news vans and reporters. Warren put the car in the park. As they stepped out of the car, Tara saw a female cop walk over. She was a tall woman with a perfectly poised posture that made her look even taller. Her black hair was tightly slicked back into a bun on her head. The reporters quickly caught on and were soon behind her. "Agent Warren?" she asked once she was close enough. "Sheriff Brady?" Warren nodded. It was clear that he had already spoken to her by phone, and Warren had mentioned her briefly on the ride over. She was the sheriff of the territory in Vermont. He was about to introduce Tara, but the swarm of reporters gathered around them like vultures, and he lost his words. One reporter asked, "Sir, can we ask you a couple of questions?" Another shouted out, "Any idea on the whereabouts of the missing hikers?" Sheriff Brady yelled over the chaos for the agents to follow her as she turned and quickly made her way through the mob. They followed her to a footpath just beyond the parking lot, where yellow tape lined the trees. When the sheriff was close enough, she lifted up the tape and stepped behind it and continued to walk a few feet more. Once they were out of earshot, she turned toward Warren. "These reporters are driving him nuts," she said as she glanced at them, making sure they truly were far enough away. "We need to open this trail back up as quickly as possible." Warren said, "That's our goal too," before proceeding to introduce her to Tara. Tara said, "Nice to meet you," as she held out her hand. Sheriff Brady responded, "Yeah, you too," as they shook hands. The sheriff then quickly reached for the walkie-talkie on her belt and spoke into it. "I'm with Agent Warren and Agent Mills. I'm bringing them in right now." Warren said, "What else do we know about the victims so far?" Sheriff Brady looked back briefly at the reporters and lowered her voice as she spoke. Early 20s, from New York, making their way up to Maine. They've been hiking for about a week. The crime scene's about 3 miles in. She gestured to some four-wheelers sitting nearby on the trail. "We'll have to ride these." Tara accelerated her four-wheeler as she forced it up a small hill on the trail. At first, riding the vehicle was a bit difficult, but with some quick instruction from Warren, who had ridden them before, she learned how to get it moving. Now, after 2.5 miles, the ride was almost natural to her. The trail was heavily shaded by the tall trees above them, but at times the sun would peek through, and Tara could feel it beat down on her back, causing her to sweat. Just when she wondered if they were almost there, she saw 3 four-wheelers parked and unattended on the trail in front of them. Sheriff Brady slowed down up ahead, and Warren and Tara did the same. "We have to walk now," Brady yelled to them over the hum of the motors. She pointed off the trail where other officers moved amongst the trees, far off in the distance. They parked their four-wheelers next to the others, and they made their way deep into the woods. As they got closer, the trees opened up, revealing a perfect place to set up a camp. The other officers picked up their heads, and one of them walked over. The sheriff introduced him as Officer Dane, and soon he motioned with his hand for them to follow him. As they moved toward a group of forensic analysts scanning the ground. When close, it was apparent what they were all looking at as Tara watched one analyst place a bloody leaf into an evidence bag. She looked down toward the ground where they blanketed the forest floor. "This was what we first spotted," Officer Dane said, where he got one of the victims. He then walked a bit deeper into the woods, a few feet away, until he pointed down again to a streak of blood. "We think he got the other one here," he added as he traced the air with his finger, gesturing to the trail of blood in front of them. Tara knew it was very unlikely that either of them survived, given the amount of blood. The crime scene was eerily similar to the others. Nothing else was left behind. No tent, no clothing, nothing. The only object that remained was a fire pit, but nothing more. She walked toward it, and she could see where stakes were pulled from the ground. They were 4 holes perfectly spaced apart, creating the 4 corners of a square. It was where the tent was most likely placed the night before, and she knew it was the killer who had taken it, along with everything else. But there was still one thing left to see that could set the crime scene apart. Tara asked, "Where's the compass?" Officer Dane's eyes turned toward a tree in the distance, where Sheriff Brady stood speaking with another officer. Moments later, Tara and Warren stood by their side, staring at the tree they were discussing. It was perfectly identical to the other scenes. The words, "They never leave," carved in jagged stripes, the sun, setting or rising, and of course the compass perfectly placed upon a lone hanging branch, so strategically that they wouldn't miss it. But as Tara looked at the compass needle, the one detail she thought would set them apart, she was surprised to see was pointing south, the same direction as the second compass they found. She said, "I'm guessing it's stuck too? The needle, I mean." Sheriff Brady nodded. It was just as Tara expected, but something else suddenly occurred to her. Who else would use 4-wheelers on this trail, besides law enforcement? Tara asked. Sheriff Brady replied, "Well, the Mid-Atlantic Trail crew often use them. They are in charge of trail upkeep. Oftentimes, volunteers will use them." She then stopped to think a moment. "And I suppose hunters once in a while, although they're really not supposed to be driving them on here. But of course, they do anyway." The same thought she had earlier rang in her mind, that the killer had some reason for targeting the Appalachian Trail. She hadn't even thought about volunteers who would have a deep knowledge of the trail and access to 4-wheelers. Tara asked, "Can we get a list of volunteers who have access to them?" Sheriff Brady responded, "Yeah, sure." Tara turned to Warren. "In the meantime, I think we'll need a bigger map." Later, Tara stood with Warren in a room in the police station. She rolled out a large map of Appalachian Trail and flattened it out on the table in front of her. Warren stared down at it briefly and then handed her the compass in its evidence bag. They had just gotten it back from the forensic lab, where it had been dusted for prints, but as Tara assumed, there weren't any prints. She held it up to the light, the silver compass needle shimmering as it persistently pointed south. They had already marked where the other crime scenes were on the map, drawing an arrow from each point in the direction that the compass at the scene showed. And after Warren marked the one they just found, she looked down at the map taking it as a whole. They stood there in silence before Tara finally raised her head. She said, "I think our original theory was right. I think it's pointing to where the killer will strike next." It made perfect sense to her. The first two victims, the couple who went missing in New Hampshire, the compass pointed north from the crime scene, and north, Tara confirmed, was where the third victim was found on a porch. At that crime scene, the compass pointed south, which was where they stood moments earlier on the trail, south of the second crime scene. And if Tara's theory were correct, the killer would strike south again. Warren said, "I agree, but we need to be careful. You never know if a killer is just trying to throw us off." Tara mulled his words over in her head. It wasn't something she had seriously considered before. She thought, what if the killer was doing this purposely? Making them think they knew something. Making them think they were ahead of him. Only to toy with them and do something drastic later. It was a thought that suddenly made her feel uneasy. She knew this killer was smart, but again, was he smart enough to outsmart them? Suddenly, Sheriff Brady stood in the doorframe, interrupting Tara's train of thought. She stood with reading glasses now at the tip of her nose, and she tilted her head downward to see above them. "We have a list for you of the Mid-Atlantic Trail crew," she said, and then turned for them to follow. Tara and Warren followed her into her office and took a seat across the desk from her. She reached for a piece of paper behind her and placed it down on the desk in front of them. She pushed the list toward them. "My officers narrowed it down by those who volunteer in the area and who had access to four-wheelers." Tara reached for it and looked it over, but was quickly disappointed by the length of the list. "There is over 20 names on the list," she said as she looked it up from it. Knowing they had little time, Tara knew that a list that long could easily waste precious hours. Warren peered over her shoulder. "She's right, we need to narrow it down." Sheriff Brady shook her head. "I'm sorry, it's the best we can do." Tara's frustration boiled. There must be some other way to narrow down the list. Sheriff Brady looked startled. "Agent Mills, like I said," but Tara quickly interrupted her. "Did you check for police records? Any illegal or concerning behavior?" "We did. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything too concerning," she snapped back. Tara took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to be difficult. It's just interviewing over 20 people could waste very precious time." She paused and let a silence fall around them as she gained composure. "You said nothing too concerning?" Tara questioned with a steady voice. Sheriff Brady spoke a bit softer now. "Well, there's just one member who was arrested for hunting illegally, and he had some sort of altercation with some hikers." She looked directly at Tara and rolled her eyes. "I didn't think it raised any flags for murder, though," she added pointedly. Warren interrupted. "What kind of altercation?" "Just a few hikers approached him when he was hunting there one day. They tried to tell him why it was morally wrong. A fight broke out. We got a call." She rolled her eyes again. "It was while he was volunteering, actually. He was supposed to be grooming the trail." "Who were the hikers he got in a fight with?" "Just a group of friends. I think there were 2 set of couples." What age? She took a deep breath, growing frustrated at the incessant questioning. I don't know. Early 20s, maybe? The same age range as the victims. Warren let out a frustrated grunt. You didn't think that was something to tell us about? He asked, but he didn't let her answer before he threw another question at her. Has he volunteered recently? The sheriff let out a long sigh. Listen, like I said, I didn't think that all made him sound like a murderer. But no, he spent the night in jail and had a hefty fine, but after that I was told he was given another chance, but he never came back to volunteer. Tara and Warren quickly glanced at each other and then back at the sheriff. Tara said, How long ago did all this happen? Sheriff pondered for a moment. That's about 2 weeks ago. He was sounding increasingly like a suspect. Tara said, Can we get his name and address? Sheriff Brady rolled her eyes. Sure, she said. But then just warning you, it might waste precious time. It was a direct hit at Tara. Tara was younger than this woman, and Tara got the sense that she didn't like Tara acting as if she knew more than her. Sheriff said, His name is Kenny McNamara. She wrote down the address and gave it to Tara. He lives a couple miles from here.